One large and two small vessels were spotted, one of them off the northern beach of Guadalcanal, 6 miles from Savo. Lieutenant John A. Thomas, pilot of the Vote OS-2U Kingfisher scout plane from the cruiser USS San Francisco, sent this message at a critical time. Admiral Norman Scott was relieved to receive the news aboard his flagship, as his Task Force 64.2 had spent hours searching for the approaching Japanese force. 4 Kingfishers were scheduled for launch, but the cruiser Helena didn't launch any, and the cruiser Salt Lake City's aircraft caught fire and crashed. Only the cruisers Boise and San Francisco managed to launch their spotter planes. The Battle of Cape Esperance was set to begin at 10:50 p.m. on October 11, 1942, when contact with the enemy was finally made. The Japanese reinforcement group included the seaplane carriers Chitose and Nishin, along with their destroyer escorts. San Francisco's scout plane had discovered them at 8 a.m. that day after their departure from the Shortland Islands. Rear Admiral Takagi Jojima led this group to Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese forces had been in conflict since the U.S. Marines landed on August 7th and secured the vital airfield. The Japanese were transporting 728 soldiers, 2 field guns, 4 howitzers, 6 landing craft, ammunition, and medical supplies. Their agile destroyers Akizuki, Asagumo, Natsugumo, Yamagumo, Murakumo, and Shirayuki protected the formation. Unbeknownst to Admiral Scott, another Japanese group was also approaching under Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. This bombardment group, consisting of the destroyers Hatsuyuki and Fubuki and the heavy cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, was racing toward Guadalcanal at 30 knots. Scott's ships were already arranged in a battle line. Destroyers Fahrenholt, Duncan, and Laffey led the formation. The cruisers San Francisco, Boise, Salt Lake City, and Helena occupied the center, and the destroyers Buchanan and McCalla followed in the rear. Each ship was spaced between 500 and 700 yards apart. With the moon set, the night was completely dark, and visibility was poor, causing distances between ships to appear shorter than they were. At 11:32 p.m., Admiral Scott ordered his column to turn 180 degrees to a course of 230, aiming to intercept the enemy and block the route between Savo Island and Cape Esperance. However, the tropical darkness led to a breakdown in formation. The leading destroyers lost position during the turn and ended up offline with the rest of the column, setting the stage for confusion in the coming battle. In 1917, a German U-boat had sunk the ship of Rear Admiral Scott, a 53-year-old veteran who had served in both World Wars. After the Pearl Harbor attack, Scott had spent time in Washington, D.C. before being assigned to sea duty in June 1942. Though he missed the Battle of Savo Island, he was at sea off Guadalcanal on August 9th. Determined to avoid a repeat of the Allied defeat at Savo, where 4 cruisers were lost, Scott trained his crews extensively in night combat, something the Americans had lacked until then in the Guadalcanal campaign. For 3 weeks, he drilled his task force in night maneuvers, keeping them at battle stations from sunset to sunrise. At 11:25 p.m., the cruiser Helena made radar contact with the enemy for the first time. The target was at 315 degrees and 27,000 yards away. Helena was equipped with the advanced SG radar, which allowed better tracking at greater distances than the older SC radar. San Francisco, using the outdated radar, could not detect the enemy. Shortly after, Boise, also equipped with SG radar, reported 5 unidentified targets at a bearing of 65 degrees via TBS talk between ships. Once again, San Francisco's radar saw nothing, so Admiral Scott had to rely on Boise's report. Boise had identified the destroyers Hatsuyuki and Fubuki and the cruisers Aoba, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, part of Admiral Goto's bombardment group. However, her report was confusing because it referred to the targets as bogies, a term for unidentified aircraft rather than enemy ships. It was also unclear whether the 65-degree bearing was true or relative, which was a critical distinction. If true, the contact would have been completely separate from Helena's. Scott, unable to make sense of the conflicting data from San Francisco's outdated radar and Boise's vague report, grew uncertain. He also considered that the destroyers Duncan, Fahrenholt, and Laffey, displaced during the earlier turn, might be the source of Helena or Boise's radar contacts. Scott asked Captain Robert Tobin aboard Fahrenholt if they were taking station ahead. Tobin responded that they were coming up on the starboard side. In reality, only Fahrenholt and Laffey were parallel to the main column. Duncan, separated from the others, charged alone toward Goto's ships. Had Scott known that Goto was equally confused, it would have offered some comfort. Goto had no radar and relied solely on visual lookouts. Around 11,000 yards ahead, lookouts aboard Ioba sighted 3 ship silhouettes at 11:43 p.m. Goto assumed these were part of Rear Admiral Jojima's reinforcement group, a reasonable conclusion given the Americans' poor night-fighting reputation at that stage in the war. It was widely believed that the Americans avoided nighttime combat following their heavy losses at Savo Island on August 9th. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison noted that from sunrise to sunset, the Americans controlled the seas, but as night fell over Iron Bottom Sound, their ships scattered like frightened children from a graveyard. Goto had no reason to suspect the ships ahead were American. He ordered the day's recognition signal to be flashed at the silhouettes and reduced speed to 26 knots. When the range decreased to about 7,500 yards and the lookouts confirmed the ships were enemy, Goto remained unconvinced. Even when action stations were called aboard Aoba, he still hesitated. The recognition signal was flashed again, and Scott remained confused. He still wasn't sure whether Boise and Helena had made contact with his own destroyers or with enemy ships. Despite using radar, Helena's gunners were confident in their target. Lookouts reported ships visible to the naked eye at a range of 5,000 yards. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover of Helena sent the message, "Interrogatory Roger," to San Francisco via TBS. Scott replied, "Hey, Roger." Hoover interpreted this as clearance to open fire, or at the very least, as a confirmation that the message was received. Helena's main battery of 6-inch guns and secondary 5-inch guns opened fire on Goto's column at 11:46 p.m., marking the official start of the Battle of Cape Esperance. Scott was shocked as Helena's barrage was quickly followed by the rest of the American ships. Explosions lit up the night as muzzle flashes and reports from the guns echoed across the water. The entire column seemed to erupt in fire. The concussion from San Francisco's guns was so intense it almost took Scott's breath away. While the crew aboard Ioba was still flashing their recognition signal, they were struck by multiple shells. Ioba was hit by 6-inch shells from Helena and Boise, 8-inch shells from San Francisco and Salt Lake City, and 5-inch shells from one of the American destroyers. The Japanese heavy cruiser lost its fire control director and 2 of its 8-inch turrets. Communication systems were also badly damaged. Large caliber shells hit the flag bridge without detonating, but killed several officers and soldiers. Among the mortally wounded was Admiral Goto. Scott, unaware that he had effectively executed the classic naval maneuver of crossing the T, had maneuvered his ships to cut across the bows of the Japanese column. As a result, the enemy ships could only bring forward-facing guns to bear, while Scott's cruisers and destroyers could fire full broadsides. At the Battle of Savo Island 2 months earlier, the Allied fleet had been badly mauled. This time, Scott had struck first and hard, surprising Goto's force. Despite this, Scott still wasn't certain his ships were firing at the enemy. He ordered a ceasefire at 11:47 p.m., but some captains didn't hear or chose to ignore the command. Gunfire slowed, but didn't stop. Scott asked Captain Tobin aboard Laffey over TBS if he was all right. Tobin confirmed he was. Then Scott asked if Tobin's ship had been targeted by friendly fire. Tobin replied he didn't know who had been firing. Scott, still unsure, ordered all destroyers to flash the day's recognition signal. 3 vertically aligned lights. Green, over white. Every destroyer complied. Scott spotted the lights flashing to starboard and, reassured that his own ships were not the targets, gave the order to resume fire at 11:51 p.m. By then, the Japanese had also realized they were under attack. During the brief 4-minute lull, they began returning fire, though it was largely ineffective. Aoba attempted to turn around and flee but was repeatedly struck as she tried to escape. Fires broke out, and only one turret remained operational after suffering around 40 hits. Captain Kijima, Goto's senior staff officer, was informed that Goto had been seriously wounded. Now Kijima was in charge of the bombardment group, but Aoba's communications were crippled, making coordination with the other ships nearly impossible. With the ship burning and unable to maintain command, Aoba withdrew to the northwest, trying to escape Scott's force and re-establish contact with the remaining Japanese vessels. Furutaka, positioned behind Aoba, was commanded by Captain Araki Tsutomu. As soon as the American ships opened fire, he realized they had walked into an ambush. His instinct was to turn left and flee the gunfire. Instead, he decided to follow Aoba when she turned right, which proved to be a poor decision. The American cruisers, Helena, San Francisco, and others, shifted their fire onto Furutaka. As Aoba slipped away behind a smoke screen at 11:49 p.m., Furutaka became the most prominent target. She was soon hit by a shell that exploded near her torpedo tubes. American gunners focused their fire on the resulting blaze, using it as a targeting reference. Helena and Boise, each with 5 triple turrets and high-rate 6-inch guns, rained rounds down on Furutaka. She took numerous hits below the waterline and was struck at least 9 times, yet still managed to stay afloat and keep moving. About 3/4 of a mile away, crew aboard San Francisco spotted an unidentified ship. The vessel flashed an odd mix of red and white lights, suggesting another recognition signal. It also seemed to communicate strange messages. San Francisco trained a searchlight on the ship, revealing the second funnel and latticework of a Japanese destroyer, Fubuki. The destroyer was completely exposed, and San Francisco's spotlight made it an easy target for the entire American column. Fubuki was hit repeatedly, brought to a halt, and eventually exploded. It was the first ship to be sunk that night. The battle was far from one-sided. The American destroyer Duncan, which had separated from the column and charged forward alone, was the first U.S. ship to be hit. She had just fired her guns and launched torpedoes at Furutaka when enemy shells killed her torpedo officer and knocked out her fire control system. The chief torpedo man assumed control and fired another torpedo. Some observers believed they saw Furutaka break apart, but this was likely a misperception. She remained afloat and moving. Duncan, meanwhile, took hits from both American and Japanese shells. One round blew off her forward funnel and ignited a fire in the ammunition magazine near her number 2 gun. Lieutenant Commander Edmund B. Taylor, Duncan's captain, activated the recognition lights, realizing that friendly fire posed as much danger as enemy shells. Unfortunately, the lights only made Duncan a clearer target. She was hit by 4 shells almost immediately, which cut her power and jammed her rudder to port. Duncan began to spin out of control, her rudder locked. At the same time, Fahrenholt was caught in a precarious position between the American line and the enemy. Like Duncan, she too came under fire. Shells struck her rigging just as Duncan was enduring her own barrage. Several crew members were killed when jagged pieces of shrapnel scattered across the deck. One fragment struck a torpedo tube that was about to swing out for launch, partially dislodging the torpedo from its mount and activating its electric motor when shrapnel entered both the tube and the air flask. Fortunately, the torpedo didn't explode, and no further damage occurred, although the motor kept running inside the tube. A second shell passed through the port side of the destroyer Fahrenholt, just above the waterline, destroying its fire control circuits and communication lines. A third shell hit the fire room, and the crew was forced up onto the deck by a burst of scalding steam. Since both hits were reported to be 6-inch shells and struck the port side, it's likely that Fahrenholt was struck by American fire. With the destroyer listing at 5 degrees, her captain, Lieutenant Commander Eugene T. Seward, ordered her out of the fight. At 11:55 p.m., Scott turned his column northwest, aligning it with the Japanese formation. The cruisers Boise, Helena, San Francisco, and Salt Lake City continued tracking and firing at targets, but it became increasingly difficult to identify which Japanese ships were under fire. The rear destroyers, Buchanan and McCalla, kept up a steady barrage. Buchanan's commander, Lieutenant Commander Ralph E. Wilson, launched 5 torpedoes and kept up a continuous fire from his 5-inch guns. Lieutenant Commander William G. Cooper aboard McCalla saw Ioba and Furutaka on fire and was shocked to observe their guns still aimed fore and aft, further proof that Goto's group had been taken by surprise. By this point, Scott's column had lost its tight formation and was strung out in a ragged line. Although unsure of the full strength of the enemy, Scott knew he had delivered a serious blow and was close to winning the battle. The advanced SG radar aboard Boise and Helena helped, but determining enemy strength was still extremely difficult in the dark, moonless night. Despite the presence of radar, one writer described the battle as a game of blind man's bluff. Scott ordered a ceasefire at midnight, but the disorganized state of his formation made it very hard to distinguish friend from foe. Some captains either didn't hear the command or chose to continue firing. All ships were then ordered to fall into a column and flash identification lights. All complied, except for the damaged destroyers Fahrenholt and Duncan. Boise was the last to fire a shot, continuing due to a fire on board that made a target visible to both radar and lookouts. Eventually, Boise's captain, Edward Moran, brought her back in line with the flagship after spotting San Francisco's lights in the distance. At 12:06 a.m., Boise and Helena detected incoming torpedoes. Captain Moran ordered a hard right rudder, turning the cruiser parallel to the torpedo's path. The first torpedo passed just clear of the port bow, and the second missed the starboard stern by roughly 90 feet. Once out of danger, Boise resumed formation, and the crew felt immense relief. The torpedoes had been fired by the Japanese cruiser Kinugasa, which opened fire on the American cruisers from a distance of 8,000 yards. 3 minutes after the torpedo warning, Kinugasa targeted San Francisco, striking in her wake with a salvo. She then shifted fire to Boise, using the American ship's searchlight beam as an aiming point. For the next 3 minutes, Boise endured intense enemy fire. One 8-inch shell jammed the front turret and hit 9 feet below the waterline. Another shell entered through the hole and exploded in the forward 6-inch magazine, killing both the magazine crew and the sailors manning the flood control station. Captain Moran immediately ordered the forward magazines flooded. Although it appeared that Boise might explode, a surge of seawater caused by the same shell that triggered the blast ended up flooding the magazines, preventing further disaster. Despite the loss of life, the shell unintentionally accomplished what the dead sailors could no longer do. Moran turned Boise sharply to port and accelerated to 30 knots to get her out of the column and avoid more hits. If the ship hadn't turned, she might have taken the next Japanese salvo head-on. As she retreated, Boise's 6-inch guns fired back for another 2 minutes. High above, Lieutenant John A. Thomas and his observer continued circling in the Kingfisher scout plane from San Francisco, observing the action from several hundred feet in the air. They saw the American column cross in front of the Japanese, witnessed Kinugasa's shells splash behind San Francisco, and watched as Japanese ships were pounded by American fire. They also saw a large orange explosion when Boise's forward section erupted at 12:12 a.m. Thomas kept circling and updated Scott with their position. San Francisco, using radar-controlled fire, launched salvos at Kinugasa after Boise exited the line. Salt Lake City also engaged the Japanese cruiser, scoring 1 hit while receiving 2 in return. 1 shell caused a fire, killing several crew members and damaging electrical systems. Scott ordered a course change to 330 degrees. Although the intensity of the battle had diminished, he still intended to press forward. The Japanese were retreating, but Scott wasn't ready to end operations just yet. He told his captain to stand by for further action, remarking that the engagement might not be over. By 12:20 a.m., Aoba, Kinugasa, and Hatsuyuki were steaming northwest, trying to escape the American fleet. Furutaka, damaged during the fight, was falling behind. The destroyer Fubuki had already been sunk. Of the American ships, Boise had suffered the most damage. By 12:19, her forward fire was out, but 2 of her turrets were still burning. Despite the difficulty caused by bodies blocking a turret hatch, damage control crews managed to extinguish the flames through persistent effort. All fires aboard Boise were finally extinguished by 2:40 a.m., and the shell holes in her hull had been sealed. Despite the loss of 107 men and 29 wounded, Boise rejoined Scott's column at 20 knots by 3:05 a.m. Aboard the heavily damaged Aoba, Captain Kikinori Kijima reassured the dying Admiral Goto that 2 American cruisers had been sunk and that he could pass peacefully into the next world. This may have been an attempt to comfort a dying man or an honest mistake. Kijima may have confused Fahrenholt for a cruiser and believed Boise had sunk. In reality, Fahrenholt, though badly damaged and taking on water, remained afloat. By shifting ballast and creating a 9-degree list to starboard, the crew brought the shell holes on the port side above the waterline. She proceeded southeast at 20 knots and was safely escorted back to base at Noumea by the newly arrived destroyer Aaron Ward. Duncan had fared much worse. Fires raged unchecked, eventually igniting 20-millimeter ammunition. Lieutenant Commander Taylor ordered the crew to abandon ship. Survivors drifted in lifeboats, watching their destroyer continue to burn and explode. Lieutenant Herbert R. Kitt, the senior officer aboard during the evacuation, initially considered grounding Duncan on Savo Island, but instead tried to save the ship by fighting the fires. Out of 243 crew, 195 survived. Later that morning, a salvage team from McCalla attempted to save Duncan, but failed. The destroyer sank 6 miles north of Savo Island, just before noon. Unexpectedly, McCalla's crew rescued several survivors, not Americans, but Japanese sailors from Fubuki. When thrown lines, the Japanese refused to grasp them, unwilling to surrender. 3 were forcibly pulled aboard, while others chose drowning or the threat of sharks over capture. Meanwhile, the destroyer Hatsuyuki rescued survivors from the cruiser Furutaka, which had been hit by shells from several American cruisers and possibly by torpedoes from either Duncan or Buchanan. Furutaka sank at 2:28 a.m., 22 miles north of Savo Island. Aoba, though hit over 40 times, remained afloat and withdrew up New Georgia Sound. By 10 a.m., she reached the shortlands and was later sent home for major repairs. While Scott's cruisers and destroyers engaged Goto's bombardment group, Rear Admiral Jushima's reinforcement group successfully landed troops, supplies, and 150-millimeter howitzers on Guadalcanal near Kukum. By 2:30 a.m., they were departing. Upon hearing of the battle, Jushima sent the destroyers Shirayuki and Murakumo to rescue survivors. They saved around 400 Japanese sailors. However, at 8:20 a.m., 11 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Henderson Field spotted them. Although no direct hits were recorded, a near miss caused Murakumo's fuel tanks to explode. A second, larger airstrike followed. It included 14 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and 13 SBDs. Murakumo lost power after being hit by a torpedo from a TBF, and nearby SBDs caused further damage with close-range bombs. Tsushima dispatched 2 more destroyers, Asagumo and Natsugumo, to rescue the rescuers. At 3:45 p.m., a third American airstrike arrived, consisting of 8 Wildcats, Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters, and 11 more SBDs and TBFs. Instead of finding 2 destroyers, they encountered 4. Natsugumo was sunk after taking a direct hit and 8 near misses that caused major flooding. She went down at 4:27 p.m. with only 16 crew and her captain surviving. Murakumo, now disabled and motionless, was also hit. Her sister ship Shirayuki fired a long lance torpedo to destroy her and evacuated the survivors. Overloaded with rescued personnel, Asagumo and Shirayuki retreated to the shortlands, where the rest of the bombardment and reinforcement groups had already gone. By daylight, most of Task Group 64.2 was en route to Espiritu Santo. Boise and Salt Lake City had already begun repairs. Fahrenholt was underway and no longer needed assistance. Lieutenant Thomas, who had observed the battle from his Kingfisher scout plane, landed safely on the small island of Tulagi. The Japanese lost 3 destroyers and 1 heavy cruiser during the Battle of Cape Esperance on October 12, 1942. Around 450 Japanese personnel were killed. Initially, 8th Fleet Headquarters at Rabaul refused to accept the losses. But when Furutaka, Fubuki, Natsugumo, and Murakumo failed to return, Japanese high command could no longer deny the outcome. Captain Kijima, Goto's chief of staff and successor in command, claimed his force had sunk 1 destroyer and 2 American cruisers. He was relieved of duty immediately. However, Admiral Tamayuki Ugaki, chief of staff of the combined fleet, didn't scapegoat him. Instead, he blamed the defeat on general negligence. He was right. Goto's failure to act on lookout warnings had left his forces unprepared. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later noted that Admiral Scott became a hero of the South Pacific during the final month of his life. His officers initially believed they had sunk 3 Japanese cruisers and 4 destroyers. Though Scott was inclined to dismiss that as wishful thinking, the damage they had inflicted was substantial. Scott was killed 1 month later on November 13th in the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. The Battle of Cape Esperance cost the Americans 1 destroyer, Duncan, and damaged another, Fahrenholt. 2 cruisers, Boise and Salt Lake City, were also damaged. Despite these losses, the Americans inflicted greater damage on the Japanese and delayed their operations. Even so, Tsushima's group had successfully landed troops and supplies on Guadalcanal. On October 13, 1942, the New York Times ran a headline reading, "30-minute combat, our ships sink cruiser, 4 destroyers, and transport at night." The article reported that U.S. Navy forces had sunk 1 Japanese heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, and a transport in a midnight battle in the Solomon Islands, effectively disrupting an enemy effort to reinforce their positions on Guadalcanal.